Okay, so we've talked for the last couple of weeks about World War II and how everything came about and everything that took place. Now we have to talk about after World War II, because there's so much stuff that really takes place. In February of 1945, it was pretty concrete and pretty inevitable that the war was going to come to an end. And it was going to be in the benefit of the Allied powers, meaning the Allied powers would win the war. So the three big leaders at that time, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, President Roosevelt, or Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, of the United States, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain, all met in Yalta, Russia, which is on the island of Crimea, or the peninsula, of Crimea, just off the coast of Russia. They all met at this resort to hold this conference to kind of just begin to come up with some ideas as to how they were going to handle the end of the war, what kind of agreements were going to be set into place to ensure that World War II would never happen again. They knew that Germany had to pay reparations, but they did not feel as though Germany had to take full blame, like with the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, that essentially led back into another world war. So they knew that, the blame had to be held accountable for several different things. However, reparations by Germany and splitting up Germany had to be done, or the territories of Germany had to be done. So they agreed, because this took place in February 1945, they agreed to come back after the war had officially ended in Europe to fully come up with a plan for what was going to take place. At the Yalta Conference, they also talked about the alliances and to keep the alliances and the role that the Soviet Union could play in defeating Japan. Because remember, the Asian front part of World War II had continued on and would continue on until the summer. Then, in April of 1945, the leaders got together. However, unfortunately, President Roosevelt passed away while in office. He died just before this conference in April took place. But then the President Harry Truman came in his place, or became the president after Roosevelt died, became one of the big three leaders, and attended this conference in Potsdam, Germany, in April of 45. So he was one of the big three: President Truman, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, and again, Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain. And there they officially decided what was going to take place. They knew the German territories needed to be split up. Remember, Germany had annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and parts of Poland, the Rhineland, the Sudetenland. So they knew that Germany had to be split up again. But this time what they did is they split it up between the USSR, the Soviet Union, and the Western democracy states. And they did this through creating 4 zones. The French had a zone, Great Britain had a zone, the United States took a zone, and so did the Soviet Union. They all took a zone. The USSR took everything east in Eastern Europe, and the Western democratic states were to take everything in Western Europe. So it was split pretty evenly between the two. Out of all of this, and for Germany, it was split right down the line of the capital of Berlin. So you actually, at one point in time, there really was an East Berlin and a West Berlin. East Berlin went to the Soviet Union, of course, because it was in Eastern Europe, and East Germany went to the Soviet Union, and then you had West Berlin, the capital of West Germany, and that went to the Western democratic states. But it was split. It was split in half, pretty much right down the center of town, kind of thing. And that is where you see the Berlin Wall develop in 1961. It actually started, was roped off or cut off by fencing and barbed wire. But then in 1961, they actually built a solid wall to solidify the difference between the two, or the separation between the two. Two superpowers emerged from World War II. One was the United States of America. We emerged because we had won the arms race with creating the atomic bomb and being able to drop the atomic bomb. And then the second power was, of course, the USSR, or the Soviet Union. Now, with this became a new war. And this new war was really democracy versus communism. But this new war, you all have asked me several questions about, and it actually turns out to be the Cold War. Now, many of you have asked, is it a war that took place during the winter months? No, it's not a war that took place during the winter months. What this war is a war of ideology. What is ideology? Ideology is the ideas and forms of politics, economics, and society. With an ideology, it's people's ideas of how politics could run, or how specific governments should run their economy and their society. With that, of course, we have the Western democratic states, which are going to be the United States of America, France, Great Britain, and all of these countries either have constitutional monarchy or some type of democratic ideas on government, which is everybody has freedom of choice, freedom of economic system, freedom of social class. Those are the main ideas of the Western democratic states. However, with the Soviet Union, they have a different style of government, and that is called communism. And their style, this new form of government that we see, was developed in 1917 by Vladimir Lenin. It wasn't developed, but it was introduced into Russia. If you remember, we talked about the Russian Revolution and why Russia really had to bow out of World War I is because, one, they had lost so many men. Two, they were uprising, the people were uprising against the dynasty and creating a revolution. Well, this was the outcome, is that the Bolshevik Party, which was a political party in Russia, was able to oust Tsar Nicholas and his family and the entire dynasty, and brought in a new style of government, which was, or is called communism. Now, communism is an economic and social structure, or a style of government where economic and social structure in which all property is owned by the controlling totalitarian government, meaning the government owns every aspect of the country. There is no private property like you see here in the United States. The government controls everything, down to which social class that you are in. There is not a chance to move up in social class unless the government deems that is something that you can do based on your abilities. And what I mean by that is they determined your job based on how smart you were, or how athletic you were, or how military-minded you were. If those were not aspects that you could put back into the government or be beneficial for your country, then it was deemed that you would essentially have a job that's going to work for the country, or everybody kind of works together to make the country great, instead of the ideas that everybody make their own choices and do their own thing. These ideas were based off of another philosophy called socialism. And with socialism, socialism again is essentially the same definition for communism, is that it's an economic or social structure in which all property is owned by the controlling totalitarian government, meaning everybody works for everybody and the government controls every aspect. People do not own their own farms. They do not own their own homes. They do not own their own businesses. The government owns all of that, and you pay back to the government what you have worked out of. You may be able to keep a certain percentage, and that percentage was very low, but the government gained the rest because the money and all the work that you did in a communistic government or a socialist government was going to go back to the country and put money back into the country. The ideas of socialism were developed by a German philosopher by the name of Karl Marx. You may even hear when we talk about the Cold War and all the ideas of Marxism. Well, Marxism is the ideas of the philosopher of Karl Marx. But the goals for the Cold War, based on all of those things, the goals for the Cold War was that the United States wanted to maintain containment, meaning a policy of checking or stopping the expansion of influence of a hostile power or an ideology. They wanted to stop the spread of communism. The United States of America and the Western democracy states had no intention of allowing communism to come and play a role in their societies. They were extremely, not necessarily afraid, and not necessarily offended, but they were extremely against the ideas of communism and wanted no part of it to come or threaten the democratic states that we are so used to. The Soviet Union's role, however, was to match their nuclear power to the United States. We, of course, were their biggest threat because we were the other superpower. You had the two superpowers. You had the United States of America and you had the Soviet Union. And these two superpowers for the next 50 years, and that's how long this lasted, was more so almost to outdo one another, to see which ideology was safer and more economically sound, more socially sound. These two ideologies fought over which one would be the better. The second part of the Soviet Union was to stop the spread of Western democracy. And with that, it was a form of containment. They wanted they were very much like the United States. They did not want anything to do with democracy. They thought democracy was too much for the people to handle, and that their ideas of socialism were the road to take to really allow their countries to grow and to improve and to become powerful. Now, the Cold War, again, spanned almost 50 years. And with that, it played a role in many historical events throughout the 50 years. There was not one single shot fired between the United States or the Soviet Union, as in we did not go to battle with each other. However, we did both sides played strong roles or hidden roles in the backgrounds of many things over those 50 years. One of those, as you see, is the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. Communism was coming into Cuba, and we did not want it that close to our borders. Remember, Cuba is only 90 miles off of the coast of Florida at the tip of Key West. So that's a little bit too close for us to really think, okay, we can have communism there and it's not going to come into the United States. But it was also filtering into South America, Central America, and into Asia and Northern Asia. So it was starting, communism at this point in time was a little scary, that it was spreading pretty rapidly throughout the world. And we were trying to contain it again. So that idea of containment, we were very strong on. So with the Bay of Pigs invasion, when communism came into Cuba, we sent close to 1,500 troops in to try and overthrow the government. And unfortunately, the Cuban government, Fidel Castro and his government, found out about it and were able to cut us off at the Bay of Pigs, which is the area of beach that it took place. We unfortunately failed in that event, and it turned out to be very disastrous for the United States. But then we also have several other things, like the Korean War from 1947 to 1953. This is why we have a South Korea and a North Korea. They fought over whether or not communism was going to spread throughout the country. South Korea didn't want it. North Korea did. North Korea tried to push through with the ideas of communism, backed by the Soviet Union, and South Korea was backed by the United States. We sent troops in to train them how to fight, and they were able to fight back. To this day, you still have a separation of North Korea and South Korea. Then you have the Vietnam conflict that many of us have heard about, 1945 essentially to 1975. Unfortunately, however, Vietnam is now still a communistic country. But the United States also spent many years over there helping the South Vietnamese fight against communism coming in, but communism won out, and it is still a communistic country. Then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and with that Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union was upset because we had put nuclear weapons and stored nuclear weapons in Turkey, which is a tad bit too close to their borders. So they took weapons and they took them over to Cuba, and they stored their nuclear weapons in Cuba. And for 14 days in October of 1962, we were on red alert because both of the missiles were in launch position, and we were literally just waiting for that big red button to be pushed either by our side or by their side for a nuclear war to start. Luckily, we're still here. It never happened. And then, of course, I've already mentioned the Berlin Wall, 1961 to 1989. That Berlin Wall was built along the border of Western Germany and Eastern Germany. So it was right in Berlin, hence the Berlin Wall. And it physically separated West Germany from East Germany, which means it separated the Soviet Union from the Western democratic states. That came down in 1989, and there was a great celebration for that. But until then, it was also known as the Iron Curtain, because it was that hidden curtain that separated the ideologies of the two styles of governments. And then, of course, you have the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Russia was invading Afghanistan. We tried to help to, and not necessarily as in sending troops, but we probably funded weapons and so on and so forth. And then, of course, you also had the space race. Who was going to make it to space faster? Was it going to be the United States, or was it going to be the Soviet Union? In 1955, the Soviet Union actually sent their first spaceship or space rocket into space. That was Sputnik. However, we had the first man to walk on the moon in 1969. That space race ended in 1972. There were many, many more things that took place over the 50 years. This is just some of the stuff that we both have played a hand in. And so it was quite an interesting time during those Cold War years of what was really happening and all the situations that were involved, or all the both styles of governments, or both governments of the Soviet Union and the United States were involved in so many intricate little things that this era, or this span of 50 years, is quite interesting. When we look at, don't drop the board. Okay, so when we look at the difference between the two, the United States, the two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, we see